He spent his whole career protecting other people's bodies on a football field. Nobody expected that when his own body finally gave out, it would still be protecting strangers he never met. This is the story of a man who died, and somehow 4 other people got to keep living. Here's the detail almost nobody caught when this story first broke. Doctors told his family that his heart was going to a transplant list. That's what everyone assumed. That's what the headlines implied. A hero's heart, beating on in someone else's chest. That's not what happened. His heart never beat in anyone else's body. It went somewhere else entirely, somewhere far stranger, and in its own way, far more important. We'll get to that. But first, you need to understand who this man was, because the ending only makes sense once you know the beginning. His name was Ronyiel Whittaker. On the 22nd of February 2026, at 46 years old, he died. And in dying, he gave 4 strangers a second chance at life. But here's the question that's going to sit with you long after this video ends. Do any of those 4 people, the ones walking around today with a piece of Ronyiel Whittaker inside them, even know his name? Stick with this one. It gets stranger and more human than you'd expect. Every legacy starts somewhere small, and Ronyiel Whittaker's started in Norfolk, Virginia, a working-class port city on the Chesapeake Bay, the kind of place that produces more soldiers and shipbuilders than professional athletes. But Norfolk has also quietly produced football players who make the league. And in the late 1990s, one of the sharpest of them wore the colors of Lake Taylor High School. Whittaker wasn't a 5-star recruit with commercials and Nike deals. He was a defensive back, the kind of player who lives in the margins of a highlight reel, the guy who does the unglamorous work of making sure the other team's superstar receiver doesn't beat you deep. Cornerbacks don't get magazine covers. They get compared to their worst play, the one time they got burned, replayed over and over on television. It's a brutal, humbling position to play. It requires short memory and total confidence. Whittaker had both. He was good enough at Lake Taylor to get noticed by college programs. And when the offer came from Virginia Tech, a program on the rise, hungry to be taken seriously on the national stage, Whittaker didn't have to travel far. Blacksburg, Virginia is a few hours inland from Norfolk. He was still, in a sense, a Virginia kid playing for Virginia. What he didn't know yet was that he was about to become part of one of the most electric eras in Virginia Tech football history, and that a teammate 2 years behind him in fame would go on to become one of the most talked about quarterbacks in the country. If you know college football from the late 90s and early 2000s, you know the name that defined Virginia Tech during that stretch: Michael Vick. Whittaker played alongside him. In 1999, the Hokies put together a team that felt, for one electric season, like the best in the country. Vick's legs and arm turned Virginia Tech into a program that could hang with anybody, and that 1,999 squad made it all the way to the national championship game. Whittaker was part of that roster. Think about what that means for a second. This wasn't a guy who played on some forgettable middling college team. He was a defensive back on one of the most famous teams in the history of Virginia Tech football, a team that, for a few months, had the entire country's attention. Whittaker played 4 seasons for the Hokies, from 1999 through 2002. Over 47 games, he racked up 7 career interceptions, including 5 in a single season 2000 over just 11 games. He also returned punts, averaging nearly 14 yards a return, the kind of dual-threat versatility that coaches love and NFL scouts quietly note in the margins of their reports. By 2001, he'd been recognized as a third-team All-American by the Associated Press. That's not a small thing. That's national recognition, a signal that you belong in the conversation with the best players in the country at your position. And yet, for all of that, Ronyiel Whittaker was never drafted. This is where the story of Ronyiel Whittaker becomes, in many ways, the story of thousands of football players who never quite get the credit they deserve. Being an All-American in college doesn't guarantee anything. The NFL draft is one of the most brutal filtering mechanisms in professional sports. 7 rounds, a few hundred names called, and then silence. Whittaker's name never got called in 2003. For most people, that would be the end of the story. A great college career, a nice piece of hometown pride, and then real life, a regular job, a quiet exit from football. But undrafted doesn't mean unwanted. In 2003, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers signed Whittaker as an undrafted free agent. It's a fragile kind of opportunity, no guaranteed contract, no roster spot promised, just a locker and a chance to prove that the scouts were wrong about you. Whittaker made the Buccaneers roster, though he'd eventually spend time on their practice squad, the unglamorous proving ground where careers are made or quietly ended. He didn't stop there. Whittaker went on to play for the Minnesota Vikings and later the Detroit Lions, 3 different NFL organizations across his career. The kind of resume that tells you everything about what it takes to survive as an undrafted defensive back in a league that chews through cornerbacks faster than almost any other position. He was, in the truest sense, a journeyman. Not a superstar, not a household name outside of the cities where he played, but a professional. A guy who turned a doubted college career into an actual NFL paycheck on pure grit and technique at one of the hardest positions on the field to play. And when the NFL chapter of his life eventually closed, as it does for every player, no matter how good Whittaker didn't disappear from football, he turned around and gave it back. Here's where the story of Roniel Whittaker stops being about statistics and starts being about character. After his playing days ended, Whittaker became a high school football coach. If you've ever wondered what happens to NFL players after the cameras move on, this is one of the quieter, more common answers. They go back to where it all started, and they try to give some kid the same shot they once got. But those who knew Whittaker say he didn't think of himself as just a coach. According to his partner, Laurie Charbonneau, Whittaker made a point of introducing himself to his players' parents in a very specific way. He didn't just want to be known as the guy who ran practice and called the plays. He wanted the parents to understand something deeper about the role he was choosing to play in their kids' lives. He would tell them, in essence, that he wasn't just their coach for football, he was their mentor. If something was going on in a kid's life, on or off the field, Whittaker wanted them to know he was there. That's a small quote, but sit with it for a second, because it tells you exactly what kind of man we're talking about. This is a guy who spent years in NFL locker rooms at the highest level of a brutal, competitive sport, and what he chose to be known for afterward wasn't his interceptions or his tackles. It was his willingness to show up for teenagers who needed an adult in their corner. Charbonneau described him simply as the guy who wanted to help everybody, not the guy who wanted credit, not the guy who wanted a statue, the guy who wanted to help everybody. Keep that description in your mind, because in a matter of months, it was going to take on a meaning that none of them could have predicted. The 22nd of February 2026 was a Sunday. For most people, it would come and go like any other. But for the Whittaker family, and for the Minnesota Vikings organization that Roniel had once played for, it became a day layered with grief in a way that felt almost impossible to process. Just one day earlier, the Vikings organization had announced the death of Rondale Moore, a wide receiver who had been part of the team. Then, less than 24 hours later, word came that Roniel Whittaker, a former Vikings defensive back, had also died. 2 deaths connected to the same franchise, inside of 2 days. It's the kind of coincidence that feels almost too heavy to be real, and it understandably shook a locker room and a fan base that had already been mourning. Whittaker's family released a statement through the Vikings organization. They didn't lead with his career statistics or his college accolades. They led with who he was as a human being. They described a man whose closest relationships knew him for his generous heart, unwavering loyalty, and deep love for his family. They called him a protector, a mentor, a source of strength, and, notably, a source of laughter to everyone lucky enough to know him. He was 46 years old. He would have turned 47 on March 19th. He didn't get there. No official cause of death was released to the public by the family in that initial statement. What we do know, from reporting tied to the hospital system that treated him in his final days, is that he suffered a brain aneurysm, a sudden, catastrophic rupture inside the brain that can strike without warning, often in people who show no prior symptoms at all. It is one of the cruelest kinds of medical emergencies, precisely because there is so often no chance to say goodbye, no time to prepare, no warning shot before the moment arrives. Whitaker was admitted, and for several days he remained on life support. That detail, several days on life support, is where this story takes its most important turn. Because those days weren't just about grief, they were about a decision that had been made long before that Sunday ever arrived. Somewhere in Roniel Whitaker's past, maybe at a driver's license office, maybe filling out paperwork with barely a second thought he checked a box. Organ donor, yes. It's one of the most consequential single decisions a person can make, and for most of us, it happens in about 2 seconds, standing at a counter, signing a form, moving on with our day. Most people who check that box never think about it again. It becomes an abstract, hypothetical kindness, something that might matter someday, in some scenario we hope never actually arrives. For Roniel Whitaker, that scenario arrived on the 22nd of February 2026. According to Charbonneau, both she and Whitaker's family already knew about his wishes. This wasn't a surprise discovered in a moment of chaos. It was something he had communicated, something they understood about him long before the crisis hit. Charbonneau put it simply, he always wanted to help in any way he could, and she believes he felt that exact same instinct the moment he checked that donor box. Whitaker was moved to the donor care unit at M Health Fairview, a Minnesota-based health system. This is a specialized unit that exists specifically to manage the delicate, medically complex process of organ donation, keeping a body's organs viable and healthy even after brain function has ceased, buying doctors the critical window of time needed to match donated organs with the patients who desperately need them. For several days, medical teams worked within that unit, carrying out exactly what Whitaker had once decided in some ordinary, forgettable moment that he wanted to happen. And what happened next is the part of this story that deserves to be understood in full, because "saved 4 lives" is a phrase that gets used casually in headlines, but the reality behind it is staggering. Right now, in the United States, more than 100,000 people are sitting on organ transplant waiting lists, according to Donate Life America, the non-profit that has tracked and advocated for organ donation since 1992. 100,000 people. Parents waiting for a kidney so they can watch their kids grow up. Teenagers waiting for a liver. Grandparents waiting for lungs just to breathe without a machine. Every single one of them is living inside a kind of suspended animation, alive but tethered to hope that a match will arrive before their body gives out. For most of them, that match never comes in time. Roughly 17 people die every single day in America waiting for an organ that never showed up. Roniel Whitaker's death changed that math for 4 of them. Reporting on his case indicates that his lungs were among the organs used in life-saving transplants. Somewhere in this country, there is a person, maybe more than one, who can now breathe because tissue that once helped an NFL cornerback chase down wide receivers on Sundays is now doing that same essential, unglamorous work inside someone else's chest. 4 organs, 4 transplants, 4 families who, on a day that started like any other, got a phone call that changed everything. The kind of call that says a donor has been found, that there is a chance now that the waiting might finally, mercifully, be over. Those 4 people don't know what Whitaker's tackling form looked like. They don't know about his interception numbers at Virginia Tech or the way he talked to parents on the sideline of a high school football game. All they know, all they need to know is that on a day they thought might be their last, someone else's decision, made years earlier and forgotten in some DMV line, gave them tomorrow. But organ donation wasn't the only gift Whitaker gave, and this is where we come back to that twist from the beginning. In addition to the 4 organs used for transplant, Whitaker's corneas were donated as well. Corneal donation is one of the quieter miracles of modern medicine. It restores sight, actual, physical sight, to people who have lost it through injury or disease. Somewhere right now, there may be a person seeing color or a child's face or a sunrise because of tissue that once let Ronell Whittaker read a quarterback's eyes before the snap. And then there's the heart. Here's the detail we promised at the start of this video, the twist buried underneath the headlines. Whittaker's heart was not transplanted into another person's chest. It was donated for medical research. That might sound at first like a lesser outcome, like the story you expected. The poetic image of an athlete's heart still beating on somewhere got interrupted. But that's not the right way to look at it, and it's worth slowing down here, because this detail is actually one of the most important parts of the entire story. Not every organ that's donated is a match for direct transplant. Sometimes a heart shows signs that make it unsuitable for putting inside another living person, but that same heart can still be an extraordinary tool for the researchers working to understand heart disease, sudden cardiac events, and the very conditions that claim lives without warning, the same category of event, broadly speaking, that had just taken Whittaker's own life at 46. When a heart goes to research instead of a recipient, it isn't a consolation prize. It's a different kind of gift, one that doesn't save one identifiable person you can put a name to, but one that has the potential, over years of study, to help researchers understand and eventually prevent the very thing that killed the donor in the first place. It's a gift aimed not at one stranger, but potentially at thousands of strangers years down the line who will never know that a former NFL cornerback's heart played a small role in the discovery that helped save their life too. So the heart that so many assumed would keep beating in someone else's chest instead became something that might, eventually, help stop other hearts from failing the exact same way his did. That's the twist. Not smaller than expected, different than expected, and arguably just as important. Throughout this story, one voice keeps returning: Laurie Charbonneau, Whittaker's partner. It's worth pausing on her role here, because grief and generosity often move in the same breath, and Charbonneau's public comments after Whittaker's death reflect exactly that. She wasn't speaking as a spokesperson delivering a press release, she was speaking as someone who loved him, trying to make sense of an unthinkable loss by pointing at the one thing that made it feel, even slightly, less senseless. She described Whittaker as someone who always wanted to help in any way he could. She said she believed he felt that same instinct the moment he decided to become an organ donor. And she said something else, something simple but devastating in its truth. You don't know what kind of impact you could have on so many lives. Most of us go our whole lives without ever finding out the true weight of that sentence. We assume our impact is limited to the people directly in our orbit, our families, our co-workers, the kids we coach on a Tuesday practice field. We rarely imagine that our impact could extend into the bodies of total strangers, into their lungs, their eyes, their future. Charbonneau got to watch that sentence become literally medically true in the span of a few devastating days inside a hospital in Minnesota. She also said she believed Whittaker would be proud of what happened, that he would be happy, in whatever way that word applies here, to know he had helped others one final time. It's a strange kind of comfort, the only kind available in a situation like this. Grief doesn't go away because 4 strangers got a second chance, but it changes shape. It gets a place to put some of its weight down. Let's zoom back out for a second, because it's easy, in a story like this, to let the final tragedy overshadow the life that came before it. Whittaker deserves better than to be remembered only for how he died. Think about the arc of this man's life. A kid from a working-class part of Norfolk, Virginia. A defensive back who was good, genuinely good, all-American good, but not good enough in the NFL's cold arithmetic to get his name called on draft day. A guy who had to claw his way onto an NFL roster as an undrafted free agent, then had to keep clawing to survive on 3 different rosters across a career that most players would tell you is a war of attrition every single year. And then, when the game was done with him, he didn't walk away from football bitter. He walked back into it, at the high school level, where there's no television contract, no signing bonus, no highlight reel, just teenagers who need someone to show up for them. He told parents in almost so many words that he wasn't just there to coach their kids on Friday nights. He was there for whatever else those kids might be carrying. That's not a small commitment. Ask any teacher, Any coach, any mentor who's ever actually meant it when they said, "My door is always open." That promise costs something. It costs time you don't get back, emotional weight you carry home, phone calls at inconvenient hours. Whitaker made that promise anyway. That's the man behind the headline. Not just NFL player saves 4 lives through organ donation. A kid from Norfolk who turned a doubted college career into a real NFL life and then turned that NFL life into years of showing up for other people's children. The organ donation isn't a footnote to that story. It's the final chapter of it, the same instinct that made him tell parents, "I'm here for your kid," showing up one more time at the absolute end in the form of a decision he'd made years before any of this happened. So here's where we leave this story, and it's a question worth sitting with. Somewhere in America right now, there are at least 4 people going about their ordinary lives making coffee, driving to work, hugging their own kids, who are only able to do any of it because a former NFL cornerback from Norfolk, Virginia, checked a box on a form years before he ever needed to. Do they know his name? Do they know anything at all about the man whose decision gave them their tomorrow? The interceptions he made at Virginia Tech? The parents he reassured on the sideline? The promise he made to be more than just a coach? Or are they simply living, breathing easier, seeing more clearly, given a second chance by a stranger they will never be able to thank? Roniel Whitaker spent his whole life showing up for people who needed him. The question this story leaves behind is whether the people he saved will ever get the chance to know exactly who showed up for them one final time, in the most unexpected way imaginable.